Hello.
Hello.
So I'm Eugenia. Today, it is the Hybrid Forms, Blending Fiction and Memoir seminar. We just did the fact fiction line exercise. If you didn't do this, just imagine where your name is on the fact fiction line for something that you're working on. We're going to look at some terms and define some terms, and then we'll have a brief writing exercise. I'm going to have a short lecture and discussion of the woman warrior. We'll do the writing exercise and come back to our handout at the end of the day, okay? So there's no clock in this room, so you have no idea how long. Oh, no, there it is. So you will know how long I'm running over. Sorry. One writes out of one thing only. This is a quote that I presented today in my workshop, and I think it's so appropriate for this seminar as well. One writes out of one thing only, one's own experience. Everything depends on how relentlessly one forces from this experience the last drop, sweet or bitter, it can possibly give. This is the only real concern of the artist, to recreate out of the disorder of life that which is art. James Baldwin. Okay? So not only do we write from what we know, but he also says that it's our responsibility as writers to excavate the experience of the people who produced us. We have a responsibility to do so. So no matter where you fall on the line, we are all here as writers working on expressing our experiences. So let's do a brief writing exercise. We'll just take 5 minutes for this, but I want you to free write a memory from when you were prepubescent, ages 5 to 11, maybe 6 to 11. Maybe your first day of school or when you were bullied, some situation that you can think of that you remember, but stick exclusively to your memories, what you know. If you can't remember a detail, you can say, well, I don't remember exactly this, but you can start with, I remember, and use that as much as you need to for a prompt. I remember when I was 6 that, boom. The point is to stay with what you know. Okay, so we'll do this for 5 minutes. Let's take a look at our list of terms. I'm going to go through this quickly. I was going to originally have us rotate around the room to read this so I wouldn't be talking the whole time, but since we're recording, it's just going to be me. Sorry, guys. So this is just a list of terms. It's not comprehensive, certainly, but it's a way to begin our conversation about genre and different forms that are out there. So the first one is the apologia, the self-justification versus the documentation. It's usually the Confessions of Augustine is the most famous from 397 CE. And the second one is autobiography. Of course, we all know what autobiography is. The older autobiographies are the life and times of the writer, and it is, by its very nature, a subjective form, where the writer is the focus of the material. It's a didactic retelling of a life. This blossomed in the Romantic period around the second half of the 18th century, and it stressed individualism, one's nature and purpose in life. Then when newspapers and printing expanded and grew accessible, the cult of celebrity grew, and autobiographies, also called memoirs in that day, followed suit. Benvenuto Cellini, in the mid-1500s, he was both an artist, sculptor, writer. He wrote Vitae. No matter what sort he is, he says, everyone who has to his credit what are or really seem great achievements, if he cares for truth and goodness, ought to write the story of his own life in his own hand. But no one should venture on such a splendid undertaking before he is over 40. Just saying. The Roman à clef is a novel with the key as a literal definition of that. It's a depiction of a real life with an overlay of fiction, often satirical, political. The characters have fictional names, and it's coined by the 17th century French writer Madeleine de Scudéry. The memoir, this is the sort of the older style of memoir, not what we call the contemporary memoir. The emphasis is placed on external events, the self and the external place in the world. The most early memoirs were military or political, an effort to record one's public activities in history, or were by famed people traversing their memories. Okay? Compare that to the contemporary memoir, which is, according to Ben Yagoda's 2009 book, Memoir, A History. It's a book understood by its author, its publisher, and its readers to be a factual account of the author's life. Okay, a factual account of the author's life. But others have said it is an attempt to make personal history and reality realer than real, to create a subjective truth based on memory. So Frank McCourt, in his 1996 Pulitzer Prize-winning memoir, Angela's Ashes, after that book came out, the memoirs had an exponential leap in the market. In 4 years, 2004 to 2008, sales of memoirs rose by 400%. Wow. So that establishes what we know today as the contemporary memoir. Sven Berkertz, in The Art of Time and Memoir, says, it is a literary matter based on fact. There's an assumption of an essential truth underlying the narrative, what he calls the conceit of essential verisimilitude, through which all of the contents of the reading are filtered. The conceit of essential verisimilitude. So Vivian Gornick, she gave a presentation at, I think, Doucher College, where she talked about how in her memoir, conversations that she had with her mother that are depicted in her memoir were really conglomerates of several conversations that she had. So there might have been one conversation that was a conglomeration of 7 or 8 conversations. And people went nuts. They said, well, how can that be fact? Then that couldn't possibly be true. So her response to that is that in a memoir, the reader should feel that the narrator is honestly trying to get to the bottom of the experience, not the literal transcription of a remembered life being put on the page. There are great confusions about the meaning of a memoir. Nothing in a memoir should be made up out of whole cloth. Everything should originate in actuality. But the interpretation of memory is what memoir is all about, the interpretation of memory. It's like history nowadays, and how come there are so many biographies of Roosevelt? Because it's an interpretation of history according to the contemporary times and how they change. So moving into the novel, in his 1927 lecture-turned-book, Aspects of the Novel, E.M. Forster presents Chevalier's definition as, it's a fiction in prose of a certain extent of over 50,000 words. He presents 7 aspects of the novel: story, people, plot, fantasy, prophecy, pattern, and rhythm. And he stresses that in addition to this simplistic structure, there's an interweaving of different threads of thought and imagery that bring cohesiveness and vividness to the whole. An underlying interconnection of all the words and elements and the ideas and the information presented, which results in an understanding and enrichment of our humanity on multiple levels. And he hastens to add, yes, oh dear yes, the novel tells a story. So it was used most popularly in England at the end of the 18th century and made popular by a rising middle class. It derives from the Italian novella, a short realistic story popular in the medieval age, and it originates from Elizabethan prose fiction, mid-17th century French heroic romances, and Spanish episodic tales like Don Quixote. Milan Kundera in The Art of the Novel says, the sole raison d'etre of the novel is to discover what only the novel can discover. A novel that does not discover a hitherto unknown segment of existence is immoral. Knowledge is the novel's only morality. A novel emphasizes character in a situation, man as a social being, and realism, an authentic depiction of human life. An authentic depiction of human life. And then I wrote down for you to just sort of know that these are the literature periods of the novel, mostly Eurocentric, but you can see there are some Asian influences as well. So if a novel is more than 50,000 words, a novella is what, typically 10 to 40,000, novelette 8 to 20,000, short story 8,000, around, this is really rough, 8,000 or less. Some short stories are 10,000. Flash fiction, 500 words. The nonfiction novel. Okay, now we're starting to branch into the sort of the very modern changed terms of form. The nonfiction novel was coined by Truman Capote for In Cold Blood. Anybody read In Cold Blood? Right. So it seemed to me, he says, that journalism reportage could be forced to yield a serious new art form, the nonfiction novel. Journalism is the most underestimated, the least explored of literary mediums. He proposed a narrative form that employed all the techniques of fictional art, but was nevertheless immaculately factual. My feeling is that for the nonfiction novel form to be entirely successful, the author should not appear in the work. Once the narrator does appear, he has to appear throughout, all the way down the line, and the I intrudes when it really shouldn't. I think the single most difficult thing in my book, technically, was to write without ever appearing myself, and yet, at the same time, create total credibility. So the author's point of view is achieved by the selection of what is chosen to tell. Did you find that his novel read like a nonfiction book, those who read it? Or did it read more like a novel? More like a novel. And what was missing there? Do you think it was because the narrator was missing? It's a good question. It's a good question. So, next is new or literary journalism. So this is probably an offshoot of what happened from Truman Capote, because there was a big outcry over this, the whole idea of a nonfiction novel. So new or literary journalism is journalistic writing that reads like a novel or a literary story. Journalistic reportage using literary and or narrative techniques, but it must be true, it must be literal, actual dialogue. And so magazine journalism has become like Vanity Fair in particular is very much like literary journalism. The personal essay. Philip Lopate, the god of the personal essay, writes that a personal essay often includes some or a lot of personal confession. That makes the reader feel less lonely in their confusion and darkness. And confession makes you a more trustworthy narrator. But that's not enough. The essay must also be artistically rendered. You must keep the reader engaged, whether with wit, conflict, mischief, and or, yes, with honesty. So it's a pursuit of ideas or a subject that interests the writer, and then it's an investigation of why the writer might be interested in that. It could be a personal experience, it could be an opinion, it could be an emotion, and it falls into the creative nonfiction category as well, broadly. Creative nonfiction is a really broad category, narrative nonfiction. And it was coined by Lee Gutkin and became its own NEA category in 1983. So this started really sort of in the 70s, I think, but was finally recognized officially in 1983. So it's an evolution of the old memoir, but it must be factually accurate. However, it is written with literary style and technique. So you use what they call fictional techniques to write a factual story. Ultimately, he says, the primary goal of the creative nonfiction writer is to communicate information just like a reporter, but to shape it in a way that reads like fiction. So the word creative refers simply to the use of literary craft in presenting nonfiction. That is, factually accurate prose about real people and events in a compelling, vivid manner. To put it another way, creative nonfiction writers don't make anything up. They make ideas and information that already exist more interesting and often more accessible. So, creative nonfiction or narrative nonfiction. The autobiographical novel, okay, it has a central character who is not the writer but is based on the writer's life. I think if you go to 2 pages over to the examples, you'll see an abbreviated list of autobiographical novels. So one is Little Women, The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. So they're categorized fiction on the bookshelves, but they're clearly autobiographical stories. The fictional memoir. these are biographically based fictions, so it takes it just one step further. So fictional memoirs, Little Big Man, Jane Eyre, Robinson Crusoe, Memoirs of a Geisha. So even it has memoirs in the title, but it's a novel. The autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which sounds like an autobiography, but it's written by Gertrude Stein. So there's your clue. So that's the fictional memoir. The semi-fictional memoir, so this is a relatively recent term. It's taken from true stories about the writer's life, but with enough fiction or measure of fiction technique such that the author or publisher chooses to label it thus. It avoids the issue of truth in memoir. So James Fry, if I say James Fry, does everyone know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So it was coined by the publisher after the James Fry debacle. And another example of the semi-fictional memoir is a memoir by Lauren Slater, who also wrote Prozac Nation, called Lying, a metaphorical memoir, she calls it. The first chapter is 2 words, I lied. So talk about unreliable narrator, amazing. Metafiction is beyond fiction, a style of postmodern fiction that is self-reflexive. The widely accepted definition is by Patricia Waugh. Fictional writing which self-consciously and systematically draws attention to its status as an artifact in order to pose questions about the relationship between fiction and reality. It explores a theory of writing fiction through the practice of writing fiction. Isn't that interesting? John Barth says it's a novel that imitates a novel rather than the real world. So a seminal example of metafiction is Italo Calvino's If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. Anybody read that? Yeah, it's an amazing book. It's an amazing book. And also a lot of Jorge Luis Borges' stories. They're also known as metafiction. And last is the true life novel. This was coined by Jeanette Walls for her book about her grandmother, Half-Broke Horses. But it's told in first person. So even though, it's really a sort of a biography, she tells it in first person. So it could have been considered a historical novel, but she felt it skewed so close to the truth that she wanted it to be called True Life. And the novel part is the fictional element of it. So what about the woman warrior? Where does this fall? Woman warrior, memoirs of a girlhood among ghosts. So you immediately think it's a memoir. It's classified on the shelves as nonfiction, but it was really controversial about its classification. It's been described as a memoir, an autobiography, a novel, a manifesto, but none of those labels. In fact, all of those labels I think apply, not just none of them. Kingston herself says that to write autobiography is to stand at the borderline between memory and invention, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. She violates the perception that autobiography is an ordered shaping of life events anchored to an external world, and that's definitely because of the ghosts part. Were you confused about if this was a fiction or nonfiction when you were reading this book?
In the beginning, I mean, when she starts out and she's in like the fables or the folklore of her culture, you're like, what? I thought it said memoir on the front. And you're reading that first chapter, and until you kind of get out of that and she goes back into her modern life, and she time jumps a lot.
Yeah, she time jumps a lot.
And
right.
You're kind of like, where am I on the timeline?
She time jumps and she fantasy jumps a lot as well.
So it would be extremely difficult to plot out.
Right. Well, there's
like
that.
Extremely difficult.
So readers often ask me, I write historical fiction, how much of your book is true? My first novel is based on my mother's life in Japanese-occupied Korea. So they ask me, how much of your book is true? And at first I used to try to answer, 85%, 92.5%. But they don't ever ask how much of that essay is true. So there's an assumption. As soon as we say one thing, it's a memoir, it's an essay, it's a short story, it's a novel, we have an assumption about the truth in the writing, right? Where would you place a woman warrior on this fact fiction line? sort of doesn't even belong. We might need a new category. Fantasy is beyond fiction, so that's sort of the continuation. But it doesn't even belong there as well. So it's which is one of the reasons why I assigned this, because it's kind of all over the map in a lot of ways. But I read this article by Joel Agee in Harper's Magazine in 2007, and if you want to look at it, it's Harper's November 2007. It's a really great article. Joel Agee, not his father. November 2007. Okay? And it's called, I forget what it's called, but there it is. Anyway, I think it takes the title from Jean Cocteau, I Am the Lie That Tells the Truth, Memoir and the Nature of Memory. That's a close approximation of what the title of that piece is. So he wrote, his memoir is called 12 Years an American Boyhood in Germany, and as the son of Depression-era writer James Agee, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, I don't know if anybody knows this, very famous, amazing, amazing book. So he says he made a surprising discovery in the course of writing that book, that he learned to remember is, at least in part, to imagine, and that the act of transposing memory into written words is a creative act that transforms the memory itself. Right? We're all familiar with that concept. In a similar vein, in Testaments Betrayed, Milan Kundera goes a little deeper, and he talks about the core of our identity, and that essentially, though we're helpless to do anything but repeat the habits, myths, and the schema of our forebears, we can't help but to imitate the past. Being human is to repeat what is human in our forebears. But it isn't a mere repetition of the past. Each identity is a new creation, a reincarnation of past humanity, no less authentic than what preceded us. Going back a little further, one of my ancient forebears, known to you guys as Confucius, says something similar, and only I can say this. Confucius says, what is the old, he says. How can we make it our own? How can we make it a reality? He says, past realities are transformed by present reflection. In restoring what was good in the past, one should not try to make something outwardly identical. It is not an imitation of the past, but repetition of the eternally true. The eternal ideas being more clearly discernible in antiquity. The wish is to restore them to their old radiance by fulfilling oneself through them. What he's saying is that we can't help ourselves. Same thing that Baldwin is saying. But what we know of the past can't be restored to what it was, obviously, but the desire is to restore what was good in the past, is about finding a new form of what is eternally true. And to do this is a way of self-fulfillment. So that's what, we as writers are doing. Finding a new form of what is eternally true. And doing it, for us, is a way of self-fulfillment. It's a way of sharing who we are. In Agee's article, he talks about what his father wrote in the beginning of Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, that the artist must suspend or destroy imagination so as to perceive the cruel radiance of what is. But is becomes was in the blink of an eye, and memories are shadows. He goes on to say, to recapture the radiance that had cast those shadows, I had no recourse except to imagine a host of possible and probable details, reluctantly at first, and then with increasing confidence and freedom. So he had no recourse except to imagine a host of possible and probable details. First reluctantly, and then with confidence, and then more freedom. So is this the process? Think about your own process, especially if you're writing nonfiction. We begin to imagine the details of that moment, that critical moment. And then pretty soon we're seeing the whole room. So this is kind of what he's talking about. So which sections were the least memoir? There were 5 sections in women warrior, No Name Woman, White Tigers, Shaman, At the Western Palace, and A Song for a Barbarian Reed Pipe. Which sections would you say were the most memoirish, and how do we know she is imagining? What was the most memoirish part for you? Anybody?
It seems to me that when she would get out of the fable, I think in the No Name Woman, I want to call it the second part, but she didn't delineate that it was the second part. All of a sudden you're reading and you find yourself in her memory. Instead
As a
of
child.
in the folklore and as a child. And then again when she mentions like multiple times a year my mother would pull out her medical degree and she talks about her mother in a way that is very real and it feels factual.
Right.
But then I think it's that second one. Is that White Tigers? When she or it might be Shaman. When she goes into her
Shaman.
mother,
Yeah.
Shaman. And she goes. That one was really woven nicely when she goes into the college atmosphere of what her mother experienced.
Right.
Experientially, it seems factual, but then she does like the ghosts and the fantasy, and you're like,
Right.
did it or did it not happen for this woman?
Right. And so then it follows up with her sister coming to the U.S. and then it becomes
Yeah.
more factual. It
The
feels more
immigration is
factual
more
because
factual.
the narrator is more present. She's more present as a child when Moon Orchid begins to appear.
And when she makes kind of the social commentary on this is the way women were treated in China.
Right.
You're like, oh, that's fact.
Right,
Like,
right.
and this is the way it was in America, and this is what it was like to assimilate. You can really see the facts in her experiential facts.
Right, and so the last section, A Song for a Barbarian Reed Pipe, is the most memoirish because that's exactly where she starts talking about that. So what's interesting is that the more the narrator appears, the stronger it feels memoirish. But let's take a look. Luckily, even my 1970 copy has the same page numbering as yours. Yeah, which is amazing. So on page 6, some of the language is when it clues you in. Very simply, if I want to learn what clothes my aunt wore, whether flashy or ordinary, I would have to begin. Remember Father's drowned in the well, sister? So I would have to begin. So already we know that she's going into conjecture. A little bit later, 3 paragraphs later, perhaps she had encountered him in the fields or on the mountain. So simple as that, but then she goes into this whole story of perhaps, and it goes on for pages, so you don't even know anymore if it's perhaps because it feels so real because she's such a great writer. And then a little bit later, she may have gone to the pigsty as a last act of responsibility. So she constantly reminds us, even though pages may go by, that we're still in conjecture. We're still in her mind. So using would and could a lot. It may have been, one time she says, it could very well have been, however. Wow, that was like, oh my gosh. I would totally edit that,
Yes, you would.
It could very well have been, however, that my aunt did not take subtle enjoyment of her friend, but was a wild woman, kept rollicking company. So these few key words, perhaps, could have, would have, maybe, may have, open the door to endless possibilities for this particular writer. And there's no reason why it couldn't do the same for you. The key is always being aware of where you are and not getting lost in it. And making sure that the reader is aware that we're still in conjecture, we're still in could have, would have, maybe. Yeah.
I was just going to comment that I think at the end of each section she comes back very much like concretely to herself now. The first section ends with, in the 20 years since I've heard this story that she just gave us, and then the one about the warrior, which I think was the most kind of fantastical in the first person. But she comes back, the swordswoman and I are not so dissimilar. So I think she's always kind of reminding you that she's still this person writing this.
And she's doing it right at the right times, in the beginning and at the end. So we always know where we are. That's really good. Even if is another phrase that she uses. So any kind of if comes in there. So Joel Agee, in his article, he cites a Harvard psychology experiment that scientifically came to these conclusions. Anytime you hear that, you sort of always really wonder, but, Harvard psychology experiment makes it legitimate. First, the act of remembering involves filling in details that were not actually stored. And second, we generally cannot tell when we're doing this because filling in happens quickly and unconsciously. So when it comes to our memories and our past, we're all liars to some degree. Okay. So when Kingston's book was published, she herself wasn't sure how it should be categorized. But because nonfiction books were selling better than fiction at the time, her publisher insisted it should be nonfiction, and the title reflects that decision. One of the reasons why she agreed to that was because nonfiction is also, poetry is also categorized as nonfiction, even today. So, and poetry is one of those genres that can be nonfiction or fiction and nobody cares. Nobody cares. So, if you're concerned with your genre, go to poetry. Not a problem. So the firestorm controversy over why this is being called a memoir largely came from a few Chinese American critics. They were writer critics. Not only did she fictionalize herself as the character Hua Mulan, she altered the revered legend to suit her own purposes. And so that was like anathema to the critics. They called this telling a falsehood of Chinese tradition and history to suit her own needs. Kingston called it using any method of storytelling in order to convey the emotional truths about growing up Chinese American in the 1950s and 60s. So she was interested in finding a fiction and nonfiction blend to tell story. And ultimately, after several books of fiction, historical fictions, and nonfiction, her last work is a volume of story told in poetry. So, she finally went there. When Woman Warrior was published, the industry, I just said that about nonfiction. So in a later interview, she said that in every one of my books, I had to create a new way of telling what I had to say. And I feel that I break through pigeonholes of what's fiction and what's nonfiction, of what an autobiography is. My next thought is trying to figure out a way to integrate fiction and nonfiction. So she was already doing this, and I think this was an interview like in the early 80s, which I think she did with Woman Warrior. From page 29, she writes, I learned to make my mind large as the universe is large so that there is room for paradoxes. And that's, I think, what this book encompasses. Joel Agee says, subjectivity and imagination, it seems, are slipping the border into nonfiction columns where they live as quasi-illegal aliens, poorly housed among the facts, performing thankless but necessary labors. I think those thankless and necessary labors were rife in The Woman Warrior. Sven Berkertz, in his book, The Art of Time and Memoir, says, the truth is in the specific psychic residue, not in the faithful mapping of episodes to external events. It seems to me that memoir, unlike reportage, serves the spirit of the past, not the letter. Indeed, no one who reads memoir believes, how could they, that exchanges happen exactly as set down, or that key events have not been inflected to achieve the necessary effect. The question is only how much departure is tolerable, and at what point does a modified recollection turn into fiction? Who knows the answer to that? I think only you know the answer to that. You as a writer know when you slip over that edge. At this point, enter the reader, because without the reader, the art exists only in a vacuum. The reader wants to know how much of that is true. The reader is enchanted by the story, by the character, by her own participation in this active imagination of reading literature. So what, when it comes to facts and our memory, is our responsibility to the truth? Agee says, obviously there are facts that should not be juggled or modified with impunity, but the beguilements of art are lies of a different kind. The ordinary liar betrays our trust. His counterfeit truth leaves us poorer. The artist magicians, even one who works in the service of a lie, cannot help but enrich us with value. That is the meaning of Cocteau's charming statement, "I am the lie that always tells the truth." Art is generous. The liar steals truth. The artist creates it. So Maxine Hong Kingston, in a 1998 interview, said something that has become my own personal mantra. Pay attention and tell the truth. And in telling the truth, sometimes you tell it fictionally, sometimes you tell it non-fictionally. Okay? So let's go back to our writing exercise, that same exercise. But this time, use one fictional element, remove a character, add one, change one fact, change the point of view, use the keywords that transition us out of factual into the imaginary, like perhaps, what if, maybe if, would have, could have. And we'll take a few minutes to do that. Okay, one more minute. Okay, so what was that experience like?
Interesting.
Yeah, compare first to the, tell me something I don't know. Alessia.
Oh, you know, I can take that.
Thank you, your grade's already passed in, sorry.
I was just gonna say, it was harder when you switch the point of view, that's what I switched the point of view from myself to my mother. So how she would have seen what I remembered as a kid. Because especially when you're younger, you know, you think you remember what you see, but then, you know, your mom tells you, and she said, that's not what happened.
Yeah,
So I thought that was interesting to do.
it was harder.
Yeah, it was harder.
Interesting. Somebody else? Yeah.
I think it was harder to lie, because I added something that wasn't true, because I vividly remember this happening, and then I just told the biggest lie.
And it was hard. Good for you.
Yay for me, I lied real well.
Go ahead.
For me, it was hard to like switch back. Like I only wanted to use like that phrase, like I could, in like one sentence, but then it kind of changed like the whole perspective of the piece. So I feel like I had to keep going with like making the stuff up.
Interesting, yeah. So, are we okay? I just kicked the thing.
I played with like changing the characters a little bit, so I characterized them differently. I think it made it more exciting, and then I also put them in a different setting. So I kept the events the same, but I think my second version, even though it was mostly live, was much more interesting. Like the characters' events were, well, the events were the same, but I changed what was happening around them, and they were characterized a little differently. So it was kind of fun, actually.
Yeah, it is. It's sort of fun too. Yeah, it opens the door. So Alice Madison, the writer, she wrote an article about how she writes both fiction and nonfiction, and she was saying how writing nonfiction is, you have the house, and the house is full of furniture, and those are your memories, and you have to rearrange the furniture in order to find the meaning of the story. But in fiction, the doors and windows are wide open. So I think that's a really good analogy to think about, you know, when you're switching from one version to the other. Lorenzo?
You already had a hand first. You wanna go?
Yeah.
So I thought it was fun to do because when I was writing out the scenario, I was just writing the facts at first. And so then when I went and revised it, I started to write more about what I would have imagined when I was a child and started to tie in the imagination piece, which nobody would really know, like, oh, this might not be true, but, you know, it elevated it. It was put you in the mindset of a child. So it really was fun.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Lorenzo?
So mine was from when I was 4 or 5 years old, and I actually believe, for some reason, it couldn't have happened, but I believe it happened. So all I had to really do was go in, and I thought. You know,
Right.
and I just had to do it, and it actually kind of clicked something in there also.
Right,
You know.
great. Rob?
It seems to me that the first time when the facts were just the facts, the lies were the truth.
There you go. The lie that tells the truth. Who wants to read? We have a time for a couple people to read their first or second, or come on up. You have to do it up here. That's the only requirement because the microphone's up here.
All right, well, I'm gonna read my second then, so you guys don't know what if I'm lying or telling the truth. What if I had realized that, at that exact moment in life, my childhood had been ripped away? What if I had realized that all innocence had been lost? What if I hadn't gone for that bag of chips, the salty sweet taste of sour cream and onion never having touched my lips? Maybe then I would have one less regret. It is only one in circumstances such as these, though. What if I had felt the deep cut of that loss instead of having the protective barrier of my religion to blunt the attack on my heart? What if I had mourned him then and there, sobs ripping from my throat and tearing my whole being to shreds? Would have I avoided a life of paranoia, anxiety? Would I have met and fell in love with my husband? Would I have panic attacks? I'll never know. What ifs and it could have beens rule my mind, torturing the little that's left of my heart. The grief trying to trick me into trading the last shred for darkness and despair. What would have been had he not had cancer at all, it would ask? Would I have been happier, more carefree? Would I still be afraid of the dark, a time of day that had never bothered me before? All of these things plague my mind, weigh heavy on my shoulders, as I sink beneath the guilt and the grief and wonder what would happen if I'd had one of my what-ifs.
Wow.
Very good.
Anything else? Lorenzo?
I'm just gonna do this so you can see what the opposite of good writing is. That was awesome.
Come on, Mr. Peach.
Uh-oh,
Put it out
uh-oh.
there,
Yeah.
Now you're gonna make me, So I'm gonna do my first one because I think it's better, you know, that I believe something actually happened when it didn't. So right. I remember when I was 5 years old and the Sandman was in my room. He was huge, ugly, mean, and he had a shovel. I didn't know that monsters could escape the television, but there he was. He raised the shovel over his head, and I pulled the covers over my face, which protected me from being killed. I screamed until I heard my grandmother's voice. "What's wrong, baby?" I lifted the covers, and there she was, but the Sandman was gone. I told her what happened. She held me and kissed me, and I yelled at my big cousin for telling me that Sandman was going to come to my room that night. Here we go in here, right?
Christina?
Oops, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It is true.
So I went in a different route. I did speculation. Pete was the oldest of the cousins. His real name is Bill or William, after his dad, Uncle Bill, but we just call him Pete. Pete's an amazing liar, but I didn't know that. I adored Pete with every fiber in my being. I'd have done anything for Pete, Pete told me, and I believed everything he told me, including the fact that a witch lived under our great-grandmother's porch. I was 6, Pete was 8, and the witch, well, she was very, very old. This conflict with family names has been going on for generations. What are we perpetually hiding? What kind of story was this? How did he know about this witch? What if something worse was under Grandma's porch? What kind of family secret lives under the porch? Porch, it's the front, the first thing everyone sees. It's the barrier between the lawn and the door. Why does the witch have to live under it? To keep people from entering the house, from discovering the truth that lies inside? What if grandmother was the real witch in this story? And what is she covering up? Did she murder someone? Steal something? Put a curse on anyone that crossed our family?
That's good.
So how did that feel, Christina, to switch to the speculative voice?
Deep into my story.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it does, it totally does. One more? Okay.
I'm shy, but I'll try. And I'm chewing gum. The worst thing you could do. No, the worst thing you could do. Interesting, we all chose when we were 6. When I was 6. I remember when I was 6, I was in kindergarten, I think really 1st grade. My brother and my cousin were to pick me up after school. I was not allowed to walk home alone, but both forgot me. I had to walk home alone. We knew the crossing guard, so that part was easy. But when I got to the other side of the street, there was a man on the sidewalk who had a hole in his neck. I remember screaming, running by him. We lived 3 miles away from school. It was cold and snowing. It was a light snow, but it was snowing. I slipped and fell face first. But my drive to get up and run fast as hell was that man with the hole in his neck. When I reached my aunt's house, I was crying, I was screaming. She asked me, "Where's your brother? Where's my daughter?" I said, "How do I know?" They forgot me.
Any questions? Questions, comments?
I wanted to ask you, Eugenia, so how do you feel about writing memoir and fiction? Because you do both. Is there a preference, or do you find yourself, if you write fiction, that you want to tell the truth in part? I mean,
So,
the crossover.
one of the reasons why both of my novels are fictions is because I felt as if I couldn't convey the real emotional truth of those stories unless they were fiction. First of all, for The Calligrapher's Daughter, my first novel, it's because it takes place in Korea in the 1930s, which I clearly didn't live in. And also because the language they're supposed to be speaking is Korean, and I don't speak Korean. So even though I did a ton of research, I never felt that I had I didn't have a position to take in this book. And to tell it as a biography, it felt, first of all, it was my mother's story. She speaks Korean, I speak English. You know, I couldn't communicate with her properly, so the only way I could really tell her stories was to make half of it up. And so that made it fiction. That made it clearly. And then as soon as I made that decision, the book came alive. So
it was more like freedom?
it was the back door was wide open. Yeah. And also I was able to tell the story I wanted to tell, which was, you know, how does a family survive 35 years of Japanese occupation and still maintain their Koreanness?
Right.
And why is that important?
And it is a good book.
Okay, sure. I'll pay you later. Any other questions, thoughts? So we're out early. Isn't that great? Yay. Thank you. Vivaria. Oh, yeah, so I put these are all the terms that we just discussed, and I put them where I thought they might belong. Yeah, so where, you know, look at your name and sort of, do you think it's in the right place now based on this discussion that we had? Yes, pretty much yes or no? And our final handout, too, I forgot about this. This is called Crossing the Fact Fiction Line in your handout. It's really a between memoir and autobiographical fiction. It's like, when do you cross the line? It's a little bit of a guidebook into how you know you're telling a fiction, how you know you're sticking with memoir.
Oh, that's nice to have.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.